national standards for the major pollutants that form smog. They're supposed to be doing it for benzene and other air toxics, but to date, the EPA hasn't done it, so it's on their to-do list. But in Louisiana, they went ahead and adopted stuff. Of course, that doesn't mean they do anything about it, but they haven't. So we have, as you see, a very short graph sample. It takes about 3 minutes. And the standard in Louisiana that they have for ambient air quality for the level of violent chloride in the air is an annual average standard. Very common for the development standard. So we don't have time as communities, environmental justice communities, doing community-based research to set a monitor out, get fancy stuff, and collect data for a year, and see what the annual average is. And what Wilma did there, when she said it was 10 times higher than the ambient air quality, what she's guideline, what she's saying is, and actually it's the law in Louisiana, the level of vinyl chloride in that sample is 10 times higher than the annual average required, in the state of Louisiana. Yet she's comparing it to that, and she thinks that's a fair representation. Why? Because there are no samples taken in that neighborhood. The ambient air monitor for vinyl chloride by the state of Louisiana is 5 miles upwind. So they don't represent what people like Mrs. Prince are breathing. So we think it's fair, and we have a MacArthur Genius Scientist to back us up, to say we're going to compare that to an annual average standard. And if you don't think that's true, then you put an air monitor in Mrs. Prince's yard and show us that it's not. What Wilma calls absence of data, and particularly data to the contrary. So if you're going to argue against us, then you bring us some data. Don't you tell us that the vinyl chloride level in Mrs. Prince's yard is below your standard when you don't have one piece of data. We don't accept that. That's not science, like Joe was saying. What's science and what's not science? That's not science. So yeah, we push the envelope. We sure do, because we have to. Community-based research is done on limited budgets in environmental justice communities, and we put the onus back on the regulators. You want that? You do it. To just say in Mossville, as a result of that, we got the US EPA to bring their big Winnebago, their Target truck to Mossville, to the sites that we monitored. And not only did they validate our data, their results were 10 to 100 times higher than the samples that we ran. Okay? So, and I could tell you stories from South Africa and other places where that's been replicated over and over again. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly is just a lot of what communities get in the way of blowback and response when they do monitoring, things like that. There's a lot of lie and omission. So this is when somebody comes in and says, in response to that, and the company actually goes, well, we're in compliance. We're in full compliance with all of our permits. That was their response to the high vinyl chloride. Well, maybe your permit doesn't cover this. Probably doesn't. So that's not really an answer. That's not a truthful answer. It's a different lie than just sort of a ball-faced lie, but it's still a lie. And we often get that from agencies, too. Well, the area is in compliance with all relevant air quality standards. And in fact, this is the case, was the case in Mossville at the time of the sample, because why? The vinyl chloride monitor is 5 miles upwind. So that's a good way to get into compliance, isn't it? You just put your monitor where it will give you what you want, a compliant reading. So we don't accept that either. What we're doing is doing exposure monitoring for communities. We're getting out there with them. We're giving them basically a replica of the human lung, so that bag can breathe in what they're breathing, and we're checking out what those levels are, and we're going to compare them to annual averages, short-term exposure levels, anything that's relevant out there, and challenge the agencies and the company if they believe that there's a different, planet out there, there's a different truth, there's a different reality. Then bring your monitor down to Mrs. Prince's yard, we'll have our bucket there, and turn it on, and let's see what's really going on. Let's see what people are breathing. Don't talk to us about risk assessment. Don't give us a model. Yesterday, if you were in New York, President Hill from the New York DEC talked about how when we took bucket samples by Tonawanda Coke and found elevated levels, that he looked at all of his risk-based analysis they'd done for that area, and all of that says that those levels of density couldn't possibly be happening. Well, what did Tom do? He went out and took his own test, and guess what? He found out, and he admitted yesterday, every one of their models was wrong. Why? Because they've never taken one test. And that's what we rely on our country to protect us right now from air toxins. A lot of models and a lot of theories, but you know what? Get out there and put them to the test. And if you're living in a contaminated area that you suspect are being poisoned by some of these facilities, you're probably going to prove it right, but there's a way to turn that upside down and be in the driver's seat, and that's by doing your own modeling.